knowledge on that regard. And just give 1 second. Yeah. So Deadpool is a Dignify Lab consultant. I've seen here explaining balance sheets to Thanos. So Thanos wasn't really sure about how to go about calculating his assets. So he's got 6 Infinity Stones and a gauntlet, no idea how much they're worth. So Dignify Labs and Deadpool, of course, to sort of help him along in that way. And Thanos is like terrible at finance. Very good at wiping out half the population of the entire universe, but not so good at finance. Okay, now let's be a little bit more serious. Dignify Lab, we won't get into the core philosophy behind it. It's all about human dignity. By the way, we are not human rights lawyers or anything like that. We just do systems and service design. Again, we'll come to that a little later. This is, again, one of those things that without explaining human dignity, getting into systems and service design doesn't really make sense. So, and by the way, we want to assure you that we're very serious. And just to give you an idea of that, we work with organizations like the World Health Organization, WHO, that is, whom you might have heard of in the pandemic, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and some startups, banks, etc., etc. So we are very serious, but we don't take ourselves very seriously. I think there's a distinction in that. And we're very fond of dad jokes. Yeah, like terrible jokes. We are not really good at it, and that's why we love them. And we not only like, but we love money. If you've got really rich people whom you know who can give us projects, we'll do a really good job, but you also love the money aspect of it. And we've got a really cool logo. I don't know what you think. I designed it myself. It took me 8 years of design.
I think, yeah, Tushar, same here. I think Mr. Suneet is having some connectivity issue. He should be with us like very shortly. Yes, guys, I think, I mean, he is just trying to log back again. And while he does that, I see a lot of cameras still off. Please switch them on. You know, it's a request which I've been making time and again. I don't want to go out calling in names and putting you all in spotlight. Please switch on your cameras. Aditya, Premvada, Abhinav, Atna, Hriday, Kumar, Ishan. I don't know. I think I'm fairly audible and pretty clear in terms of when I say that I need all of the cameras on. Orin, Swayam. Guys, I'm sure, you know, most of you were paying attention to ethics and the when Tayal sir was talking, I mean, he was talking about ethics and he was talking about responsibilities. So, you know, please put your cameras on. That's like basic ethic for this interactive workshop. And it is your responsibility to do so. I think Mr. Suneet is back here again. Mr. Suneet,
I'm really sorry for that.
no worries at all. Over to you again then.
Yeah, sure. I'm back. Did you guys miss out on too much? I hope.
Well,
Was this covered?
you were talking about the logo.
Oh, the logo. Okay, that's cool. Okay. So we'll go to the next slide, and I'm just going to keep my video off because the net is terrible right now. Of course, when you need it most, then it doesn't really work. But we'll actually come to the question answer session when I can have my video. I hope the net is fine by that. Okay. Good. Sure. I think we've angered Thanos. Maybe he's the one controlling this stuff. No idea. Okay. So yeah, I know that I look really young, and I was really old when I was born. I'm like 30, I was 58 years old 30 years ago. And I have a tendency to speak really fast. So I'm sorry for that. You might have to struggle to keep up a little bit. I am a systems thinking geek. So that's the reason why I will be taking this session. And despite my looks, I'm not an undergrad college kid. And yeah, I'm easily bored. So I must do cool stuff all the time. But the definition, what I call as cool, is really boring for most people. So what you're going to do? And I hate jargon, except when I use it. So isn't that the case with all of us? Okay, let's get started, shall we? Let's talk about wicked problems. Now, this is one of my favorite villains from back when I was a kid. And there was this Cartoon Network television series called Mojo Jojo. I've always wondered how wicked this creature actually was. So the first thing that comes into my head when I think of wicked is something like this, right? And maybe even this, right? Or maybe this. I don't know if this is wicked or not, but the general connotation of things being wicked equals sort of evil, right? And that is the kind of perception that we have in our heads. Anything that is wicked, that is evil. Okay, that's one, the first part of wicked problems. The first part of that is wicked. Now, the second part of that word is problem. Right? So what comes into our heads when we think about the word problem? It's usually something like this, right? There is someone who is undergoing a situation. Either you are the person in that car who's just had this god awful accident, or you're the person who's the one who's observing this happening. And that is like a different kind of a view, right? When you're in the car and you're faced with this situation, it's terrible. But to an onlooker, it might seem silly, funny, or at a distance, it might seem tragic, but that's basically it, right? So this is what we call as a tough situation, a problem. And there are different scales and different intensities of problems. So, okay, but generally speaking, you get it. Now, if you were to come to this thing called what are wicked problems, right? Now, this is something that is really interesting. So let's straight away get to some of the characteristics of wicked problems. Okay. The first one being that it's really complex. It's really, really complex. And what do I mean when I say complex, right? So there are different types of complexities. So this is what you mean when we say complex. When you look at any electronic gadget, right, and then you try and just break it down into its various components and parts, you see each of these things, it seems really complex, right? So imagine these circuit boards, what it must have taken to design these circuit boards, to design all of the various electronic components that are coming together and forming this beautiful device. But it is immensely complex. Now imagine if somebody had to repair this, right? It is complex. Now, how about this? How about cities? Or just imagine a city like Bangalore, or you want to go all the way to some of the biggest cities of the world, something like New York. Then just imagine the kind of complexity that you are faced with. Now, when I'm talking about complexity, right, think of it from the lens of if you were to fix anything here, how much effort would it take? Imagine there's a huge storm and the pipelines, the gas pipelines that run beneath the city, they are sort of disrupted and they're damaged. And now you have this task of ensuring the safety of the population. At the same time, you have to do a very quick job of fixing all of these pipelines. There might be other effects for that as well, right? For example, when the pipelines are damaged, it could have caused damage to other infrastructure as well, such as roads, right? Or your electrical lines, which would cause problems in so many other spheres. So just imagine the level of complexity as compared to an electronic gadget. Here, the level of complexity increases. And what about this, right? So this is a human being, like you might be familiar with it, you and I, human beings. And this is a child, right? So let's say about 5 to 7 years old. I have no idea how children look when they're 5 to 7 years old. I'm assuming this is that. And what goes on inside our brains? I'm just going to give you one example. The human body is one of the most complex things that there ever has been, there ever will be, for that, most living organisms. But because we are sort of a little bit up on the evolutionary chain, sort of, I think so, then the level of complexity that happens in our mind, right? So what we see here is a neuron. So this is a brain cell. These neurons, we've got 86 billion of these neurons. And the way that they are wired together, right, the way that they are interconnected, causes us to learn things like speech, basically anything that we learn, like speech, talking, doing, thinking, anything, right? There are 86 billion of them. Just imagine, in order to fix a gadget, the kind of skills and the kind of approach required, to do something for cities, the kind of approach required, and to do something for the human body. Right? When it comes to biological stuff, the kind of skills that are required are quite different. And very frankly, it's immensely complex to do all of these things. Right? So this is what I mean by complexity. There are huge orders of complexity that happens. Now, the second thing, the first one is really complex. The second one, wicked problems are all interconnected. Now, what do I mean by that? Whenever we have some kind of a problem, right, the general terminology that is used to say that, okay, we are dealing with it in a really nice manner, we use this word called root cause. Okay. The problem with such a word is that, see, when you look at a problem, right, you sort of tend to isolate it. You're faced with a toothache, right? Then you go to a dentist, right? Because you know that, okay, you have isolated the problem down to oral hygiene, something related to your mouth, your teeth. Then you would go to a dentist, right? And then the dentist will examine your tooth, right? And then they are going to see, okay, there's a cavity there. So then you say, okay, the root cause is that there's a cavity, and then you're going to plug that tooth out, or maybe fix it, clean it, whatever, right? You might get a crown or whatever. But that is a very, very isolated view of something. So of course, when you're doing that, right, you're not then, when you have a toothache, you know that it's a toothache. In many cases, you don't even know what is the problem that you're dealing with. You might be facing a pain here on your forehead, right? And it might be related to a nerve that connects your jaw to the forehead. I don't know, it might be that. But when you go and see a dentist, the dentist may or may not be able to identify it, right? In that case, you didn't know that it was a tooth problem. You did not know that, right? Even the dentist may not know that. It turns out that after further diagnosis at a large hospital, multi-speciality hospital, it turns out that though you're having a headache, the cause is that there's an extra tooth that's growing at the back. And that's where you need to actually get things fixed. And this is when we say the word root cause, right? It can be very misleading. This is one single plant, and then you have just root. But the reality of today's world, as it has always been, in fact, is this. How do you make sense? If it's the root cause, okay, what do you make sense of this? Like, these are all roots, right? And this is not an individual plant, not an individual problem. That is a metaphor that we are dealing with. We are dealing with problems that are interconnected. You don't know, like, okay, if this tree is dying, the one at the back, this one, we don't really know which roots are the ones that we should now go and revitalize so that this tree starts living. We don't know that. You cannot identify it. Beyond this particular area, you won't know what's happening, right? So that is exactly why we say that root causes are something that may only appear to be root causes. The reality of it is that it's all interconnected. So that's the second thing. The third thing is that it's uncertain. And by uncertainty, I also mean unpredictability. Right? So whatever you think is going to happen tomorrow, there's a high chance that it might not happen. Right? So because there's all that we actually do is that we take educated guesses and we hope for the best. When we say that we've got a morning routine, we say that, okay, tomorrow the sun's going to rise, and there's a high likelihood that it is going to rise. But there's also a possibility of the world stopping, like in its tracks because it was struck by an asteroid. The possibility of that happening is very low, but it does exist. So when we say that things are uncertain, any kind of a problem that we face, and then we have a very premeditated kind of an approach towards it, that the problem is going to remain the same for the next 5 years, 10 years, of course not. It is changing. And that's why we say there's a high degree of uncertainty and there's a high degree of unpredictability as well. It's very difficult to predict what's going to happen next. Now, let me, just to explain this point, right? Now, let me give you an example of this. Now, what we see here is an arrow, right? If you were to ask someone what this is, given the context of this presentation, you will say it's an arrow, right? That's fine. But when we actually try and understand it using some of the other context that is provided, it might turn out that this arrow is not actually in flight, it is resting on a table. But without the context of the background, right, there is no way that you could have told just from that picture whether the arrow was in flight whether the arrow was lying on any kind of a surface. The added context of the table actually gave us this idea. Or it's possible that it can be a painting of an arrow on a white background. You needed to zoom out and then you saw that, okay, there is a frame that is surrounding this and it seems to have been painted onto a canvas, right? So just that picture was misleading. Similarly, if you were to now say that, okay, this arrow is in flight, right? You see a bow there on your left and towards the right, you see some sort of a target, right? But you don't know that what is happening. Are we going to kill someone innocent? Is somebody has just launched this arrow? Are these just props that are kept? Then you might even want to zoom out further and then you might see that, okay, there's a villain that's there, maybe deserves to die, I don't know. And you have these kind of information that is provided to you only and only because of the context that is surrounding it, right? It is not just limited to the arrow itself, rather it is the context, okay? Now let's go to the fourth thing. So we've got this very, very trippy kind of a visualization. This is just to know that things are always changing. Nothing stays the same. When it comes to wicked problems, right? The tendency that any kind of a wicked problem, you have to be mindful of the fact, how is it changing? It changes day to day. It can change to various degrees in, like various intervals of time. Let's say that the change in one day might only be from X to 2X. It has doubled, right? But the change, if it is a compounding one, you'll see in a very short amount of time, drastic things happening, which is what is happening with the pandemic, right? You have few cases and then you say, okay, it's doubling, it's doubling, it's doubling. And all of a sudden you have this huge growth trajectory, which is taking place. Why? Because the rate of change is very fast. For wicked problems, or for problems that are not usually, like fall within the realm of easily solvable problems, let's call it that, you'll find that the moment you try and go and address it, right, the nature of the problem itself has changed. So it is forever changing. It won't change once or twice. It will keep changing. There are n number of variations that actually happen. Okay? Now, if you were to talk about just to understand how fast change happens, this is an example of just 1 minute on the internet. You might have come across this on various social media platforms. Just imagine there are about 6,700 packages shipped from Amazon within 1 minute. No wonder Bezos is so rich. There are about 350,000 stories shared on Instagram in 1 minute. Right? And just imagine the pace at which the world is changing. Imagine one story which is launched on Instagram and it is shared by so many people. The degree of change that can bring about is immense, right? So that is why we live in a time in which there is huge change happening within very short intervals of time. That is just an example of change to give you the idea of scale. And lastly, we've got that wicked problems have no absolute solutions, in the sense that what we're always trying to do is treat the symptoms, okay? And I would not like to use the root cause, but I'd like to use the word as the stuff that is causing the symptoms, right? So if you want to treat a disease, we have to be able to understand what is causing the disease, right? And that to just an understanding of the disease is not enough. How it actually affects the human body, okay? To that also, we might not be sure. We have to, just be able to fight it as and when we learn more about it. Again, COVID is a great example of that. When the pandemic started, we did not really know how to do it. The WHO actually told that if you are not having these symptoms, it's okay for us to not wear masks, which now in retrospect seems, how the hell can they even say that? But it was always a learning cycle. As and when information became available, then more and more recommendations were done. Gradually, people learned, and we are at the point now where we've got vaccines, right? And that happened through a process of learning, and that is why we say that there are no absolute solutions. And the problem with absolute solutions, and just to illustrate this fact, let me give you an example. So this is something called as a cane toad. Now in Australia in the 1930s, there was a huge problem of small insects called cane beetles. So they were like destroying crops, okay? And the farmers, they said, we did not want to use all of these toxic fertilizers. So as a form of biocontrol, they're going to be introducing this species, which can actually eat up these beetles, right? 102 toads were brought in 1935, right? Now the population of the toads is 1.5 billion. The creatures that were bought to get rid of pests became pests themselves. It quickly went out of control. So what we might consider to be solutions, like root cause solutions or innovative solutions, it is very highly possible that they can actually lead to tremendous side effects, which at that point of time may not be obvious, but it happens way down the line and we did not really see it coming. right? And it happens very quickly. As I said, change happens really quickly. And then you find that you're faced with a different type of problem altogether, which is either comparable or even worse than the problem that you were originally facing. The same thing happens with policies. So let's say that the government or any kind of an organization launches a policy to fix an immediate problem, but that causes different kinds of problems when it goes forward. So that's called policy resistant. Again, boring stuff, will come to that. Now, just to summarize, wicked problems are complex, they're interconnected, they're uncertain and unpredictable, they're constantly changing, and they have no absolute solutions. Right? Okay, now some examples of wicked problems. You might be wondering, okay, we're here to talk about business, we're here to talk about like finance, economics, all of these things, right? So how do we actually understand these things from the point of view of wicked problems? Again, if I were to revisit this slide and ask you that, when you think about business, right, isn't it all of these things? Just think about it. Isn't business immensely complex? Any organization, right? Just imagine when demonetization happened in India. You're a small time businessman who's running a small grocery store, or you're a large bank who's got tons of like reserves of cash. Demonetization is launched, and all of a sudden you find, oh my god, I had never predicted this. This is very uncertain, very unpredictable, right? The landscape changed almost overnight. And then, of course, there were no absolute solutions to it. People are still struggling. There have been estimates that the damage done during the demonetization period to the Indian economy is still, like it's happening till today. It was quite tremendous. It wiped off, it shaved off quite a bit of the growth percentage, economic growth percentage for India. And all of these things are interconnected. You cannot say that, okay, demonetization happened, only businesses were affected. Of course not. Everything, businesses rely on consumer demand, on people like you and me actually buying stuff when we don't have money, right? And India is a cash heavy economy. We love to use cash. At that point of time, when that happened, then you saw that, okay, households were facing difficulties, especially from the marginalized communities, to actually pay for stuff. We did not have cash ready. And then the bigger notes were not in circulation anymore. So it's a huge mess, right? And that is what we mean when we say that businesses, and demonetization is just one example. You have pollution, which is again another wicked problem. You've got poverty, that's another. You've got lack of adequate levels of literacy / education. These are huge problems, and they're really wicked. You cannot say that, okay, now the government is going to launch one policy, or Bill Gates is going to solve this by giving so much money. It never happens. No absolute solution. And that is why these are all called as wicked problems. And now coming, when we talk about businesses as wicked problems, I've just shown you, given you example as to why we think of it in that. Okay, now that we know that these are by and large what we call as wicked problems, what do we actually do to address it? Now, if we say that, okay, there are no absolute solutions, right? There are no, let's say, one-shot golden arrows that can just kill the giant. Never going to happen. So how do we actually do that? In order to do that, we have to understand something called the art of inquiry. Okay, the art of inquiry, now again, this seems a very, very jargony kind of a thing. But the actual, I'm sorry, okay, now it's fine. So the art, when we say the art of inquiry, we are basically just trying to tell that how do we actually go about understanding something? In order to fix something, you have to understand it first, right? You cannot just run blindly into the battlefield thinking, okay, I have got the best sword, I've got the best armor, and I'm like really skilled at what I do. It doesn't mean you're ready for battle. You have to understand the lay of the land. You have to be able to be able to inquire, basically, understand. And when you say research, all of that, it essentially boils down to this. Now, if I were to ask you, what is this? Like without any context, it's just this red thingy on the screen, right? Now, if you were to ask, okay, this can be things like a red ball. It can be a clown's nose. It can be a red dot. I don't know, anything. So if we were to actually try and understand what this is, there are different kinds of ways we might go about doing it. But we are actually hardwired to do one thing, and that is to actually cut it and examine, okay, what's on the inside, right? So let's say that we do that. We cut it, we split it open, and we find, okay, it contains these two things. We don't know what they are. Is it possible for us to subdivide it even further and see what that happens? And you say, okay, there's another ball there as well, right? And then you try and examine the properties of that. Basically, what we are trying to do is we take something and then we are dissecting it and then further subdividing it to understand, okay, what this thing actually is. And isn't this something that we do in biology? Isn't this something that we do in physics as well? When you talk about atoms, right? When you talk about the molecule, then you talk about electrons, protons, atoms, etc. Then you've got subatomic particles as well. What are we doing? We're just splitting them down into smaller components and trying to understand that, okay, if the smallest unit behaves in this way, the larger unit must also be behaving in somewhat similar way, but at a different scale, right? We try and understand these units. Okay, how is it all arranged together? It's like this complex machinery that you're trying to understand. How is that? In biology, we look at cells, right? One of the first things that we are taught in bio is, what does an animal cell look like? What does a plant cell look like, right? Remember all of those diagrams with the stuff, nucleus, mitochondria, remember that, right? So all of those things is this kind of an approach, okay? This is what is called as an analytical approach or a reductionist approach, right? Now, there's another way that we can also inquire about something. Instead of splitting it, and trying to subdivide and dive deeper into it, what we can do is we can place it in context by zooming out. Sounds like a lot of words. I'll tell you exactly what it means. See, if we zoom out and then we see that, hey, this thing, okay, I'm going to call it a ball for now. This ball kind of a thing looks like it's attached to these other things as well. And don't worry, I'll give you a concrete example of this. So just bear with me for now. What you see is that on zooming out, you would never have expected it to be attached to these other things as well, right? This seems really interesting. Had you only been focused on subdividing it, you would not have gotten these kind of perspectives. And then you zoom out even further, and then you realize, hey, the same kind of a pattern is repeating in different ways, and they are configured differently. But we know that, okay, this kind of a unit seems to be recurring, right? This is a pattern that we managed to recognize. Had we been obsessing only over this red ball thingy, we'd never have been able to understand this. Now, let's come to an example of what I mean by this, right? So let's first look at this round thingy again. If I were to ask you what this is, you'd be giving like guesses. Okay, like some people say, okay, this is a rock. When I showed this to some other people as well, they said it looks like a peppercorn. Kala mirch. Okay, it looks like that. It also looks like a very tiny meteorite. It looks like, I know, so many different kinds of things. But if you were to say that, okay, now we want to actually find out, having guessed, we want to find out what this is. What would our default reaction be? We'd want to split it open and see, okay, examine it under the microscope. What does this actually look like? And then we see that, okay, having gotten to a certain level of zoom, you see, hey, there are certain types of crystals, right? They are arranged in a certain manner. Are we familiar with what these things are? And what about this, right? So when you can also use an electron microscope to actually zoom in even further and say that, okay, maybe there's a cell, the molecular structure is sort of, like reminiscent of this kind of a substance that we are familiar with. And this is exactly how, like geologists and science works. That's what we say, right? But then how about another way? Like this is a very techie, sciencey kind of stuff, right? Like the traditional sciencey stuff called Cartesian science. We'll come to that later, sometime maybe. We'll see. But what about a different kind of an approach where we zoom out? Remember when I said that we can place things in context? Now imagine you have this, right? If you wanted to place it in context, we can ask things like, hey, where was this found? Right? Then you might say, okay, this was found somewhere near some kind of a rock formation. And this rock formation is very close to this kind of a volcano, right? And this volcano seems to be dormant. By the way, it's a live volcano. What are you doing there? Don't be there. So here's a volcano, and then you see that, okay, the lava flows in certain kind of a way, and it sort of, travels to where this kind of a rock formation is found, right? So is it possible that this is something that is made of this kind of a material? We might also say that, hey, I've seen water bodies when it interacts with these rock formations, it tends to give it some kind of a shape. Is it possible that there's some kind of a water body nearby and this thing was rolling in it, because of it became this round object? Is it also possible for us to guess that, okay, hey, what's the kind of flora and fauna that is found? What are the plants, insects, animals, etc., that are found near it? We do know that certain species, both plants and animals, have a tendency to prefer certain kinds of stuff for their habitat. If you see, let's say, one insect trying to prepare its habitat with this kind of a rock, it's possible for us to again gain some kind of an understanding with that. We might also say, hey, what's the weather pattern like here, right? Is there tremendous amount of rain that this place is receiving, because of which these water body interactions might have increased, and then these stones rolling around may have caused these kind of shapes to be formed? Or can we also take a look at some kind of human interventions that might have happened? Because of huge amount of deforestation, the weather pattern might have been terribly disrupted, which might have caused weather patterns to change, which might have then caused these rock formations to be formed. Now, again, as you can see that we did not even once talk about splitting it open and trying to find out, okay, what is the cellular, what is the crystalline structure, what is the molecular level structure, etc. We didn't do that. Rather, we put it in the center, and then we tried in building a context around it. And that is the essence of the opposite of the analytical approach, which is something that we called as the synthesis-based approach. So you've got analysis and you've got synthesis. Okay. I hope I'm making sense. And then we come to this topic that we said that, okay, addressing business complexities through systems thinking. We've established businesses are complex. Yeah, great. So what? Systems thinking. How do we actually use it? What is it? And how do we use it to actually solve these kind of problems? When all the stuff that I've explained to you in the synthesis-based approach, instead of cutting stuff down and reducing it, we place stuff in context and try and understand what are the relationships that it is forming with the things that are in and around it. Right? And that is what systems thinking is. A system is an integrated whole whose essential properties arise from relationship between its parts. We'll come to that again. But basically understand it's a synthesis-based approach, and systems thinking is basically using this kind of a mindset that to place things in context. Don't think of it as samples that exist within laboratories to actually do your research, right? Similar, when you're trying to solve a problem in a business, don't think that, okay, I'm only going to think about my business and not the world, because the business exists in a certain context. And that is where we say the business is not inside a laboratory for you to tinker around with. Rather, it is like placed in the world that is very complex. It's forever changing. It's unpredictable. And that's what we mean by systems thinking. Now let's come to this integrated whole and parts and all of that. Okay, what does this mean? Before getting into that, I'd just like to put this statement, which is very core to the systems philosophy. The whole is more than the sum of its parts. What this basically means is that if you've got 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus all of that, 1 into whatever number of things, you basically add them together, right? And then say, okay, 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1, whatever. If there are 35 of them, then it's equal to 35, right? But that is not the kind of equation that we're talking about here. Rather, we're talking about something like this. If there are, let's say, 1,000 people in a village, and you want to know the population of the village, right? You're not going to say 1,000 people, but population is 1,005. That's not what we mean. Rather, what we mean to say that the village is more than just the sum of its people. That is the like philosophical thing that we're going for here. Don't just understand things from a very numeric perspective. Rather, understand that people interact with one another. They interact with everything else, and which makes this beautiful village that we see in the real world. It's not that the population of the village might be 1,000, but that is not the village. The population of the village is not the village. That is the kind of thing we have to understand. Why? Because of the interaction between people that is happening. So you've got what we call these things as elements and not your chemistry elements. Okay, forget that. These are called systems elements. So if we say there are 5 elements, right? 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1, the interaction between them will make them more than 5. That's what you mean. That's the philosophical statement. Now, coming to whole and parts. Okay, what is this whole and parts? If we were to take the whole as the business, okay, then the parts would be the people, the processes, the equipment, the money, etc., etc., etc. Right? So if the whole was the business, then the parts would be such and such. Of course, now the business, you cannot say this equation is like business is equal to people plus processes plus equipment plus stakeholders plus I don't know money, whatever. It's not just that. There's so many different kinds of things that come together and interact with one another to actually frame what is called as a business. Similarly, if you want to now zoom out, now if you want to talk about the economy of a nation, then so many of these businesses become the parts, right? In earlier cases, when the business was the whole, things falling under the business umbrella were the parts. Similarly, in an economy, when you're talking about the economy of a nation, you've got businesses themselves which become parts, and then you've got policies, banks, etc., etc. Whatever comes under the economy umbrella would become the parts. I hope that's clear. And okay, now I've got very little time to wrap things up. Okay, now there are 2 thoughts that we want to actually be very mindful of. So one is businesses as machines. Machines are these unmoving things which cannot adapt, like because it's programmed to do a specific thing. It cannot regulate itself. You need an operator to actually do things. And it always learns externally, in the sense that somebody has to tell the machine that, okay, you are fixed in this way. Now the machine is capable of doing that. Compared to that of viewing businesses as living organisms, in which businesses live and breathe. Now, if you've seen the complexity at which businesses run today, you can clearly see that businesses are more like living, breathing organisms, because what it consists of people like you and me. It consists of all of these various processes that are made by people. Right? And you talk about business as an organism, you actually have vital parts. You have businesses that learn. So when you talk about a business, think of it not just as a machine that is programmed to do certain things. Okay, business must, like churn out profits. Business must cater to XYZ stakeholders. Business must, have efficiency in processes. That's a very machine kind of a view. Rather, a business must learn. A business must understand how to adapt to changing contexts. That is the view that we need to take when we're talking about systems. And there is this thing that, any kind of a living thing, it cannot be understood in isolation. Okay, I'll give you an example of a neuron. Again, when we come to that neuron, right? One single brain cell cannot give you insights into how intelligence works. It's never going to happen. No matter how much you dissect it into its, like, okay, myelin sheath and the nucleus and the dendrites, whatever. You're never going to be able to say that, okay, intelligence is caused because of these neurons. You have to take it in totality. You have to see how neurons are wired together within the brain. When some stimulus is provided, you find, okay, something new is emerging. It was not there in the one neuron itself, but because of all of these interactions, something new has emerged. And by the way, that is another property of systems thinking, is that it's emergence. Whatever you saw, you might not be able to see in the parts, but the whole has another property altogether because they've all come together and they interact. And that's why you've got emergence. Now, the core thing of systems is that think about everything. Like if you're talking about any problem, think about stuff in terms of connectedness, patterns, relationships, and context. Okay. So what relevance this has for business? Understand the context within which problems exist. Now, I understand that there's going to be a hackathon. The problem that you're going to be dealing with, right? You have to place it in the context within which you want to actually understand. Don't look at it in isolation. Now, just to give an example of that, in 2019, just 20 polymer producers or plastic producers, let's call them, are accountable for more than 50% of all single-used plastic produced globally. Just imagine, so few people causing such a huge impact, right? And if you were to only obsess about, okay, why are these organizations, like producing plastic, there has to be laws, there should be legislations, why are they not being taxed, etc. But then when you look on the other side, you find some of the biggest banks are financing them. Do you think that those companies would have been able to produce that amount of plastic without, like having financing behind them? You've got big banks that are actually bankrolling them to produce this plastic, right? Then you've got these banks who are actually doing lots of marketing campaigns that we recognize that our planet is in danger. We are building a sustainable, resilient, prosperous future. And they are actually being awarded in the industry because of this. So now whom are you going to blame? The media? You're going to blame banks? You're going to blame consumers? You're going to blame the plastic companies? Whom? And that is where this needs to be categorized as a wicked problem. No one-shot solution. You cannot say, okay, media regulation. You cannot say, okay, government now needs to tax companies. You cannot say banks don't target these companies. It's very difficult to do any of those things. And that's why it is so difficult to tackle. And just imagine, what is the consequence of that? In the next 5 years, right, single-use plastic from fossil fuels is going to increase by 30%. And you see, oh, we are working towards net zero carbon emission, etc., etc. But this is the reality because these wicked problems have not been addressed. And so this is the question that I'd like to ask you. That you have happy customers now and are making tons of money, right? There is no doubt in that. But who is going to shoulder the larger responsibility? Having studied from some of the best institutions, right? Are you going to become one of those people who is only going to care about what the company expects you to do? Like, okay, I'm going to earn lots of money. You will be rich. There is no doubt in that. But who's going to take the larger responsibility of that, of the planet, of future generations? Who's going to shoulder that, right? Who's going to care about human dignity? Right? I had to plug this in somewhere. Who's going to care about human dignity? So at Dignify Lab, we want to do that, right? So, and that's what it is. So when we're talking about thinking in systems, now this is just for the hackathon, right? I'm going to give you just 4 things that you can actually follow. First one, Contextualize the problem. A good way to go about doing that is PESTLE. Put the problem within the context of the following thing, right? So the following context will actually define what the problem looks like. It'll help you understand the problem. Talk about what is governing it in politics. Okay, I understand you're in class 12 and you might not be able to get to that detail, but think about it, try. Okay, think about the economic implication, which is like the monetary side of things. Think about the social aspects, about people and how people help either contribute towards the problem or can actually solve it. Think about some technologies that are actually helping it. Legal is okay, we'll drop legal because again it can get really complex, but ideally you should be thinking about that. And think about the environmental implications of whatever the problem is. So that's one of the ways to get started. Second is collaborate. Never do things in isolation. I know something really well, I'm going to do it by myself. Never works out. You can never understand anything in its entirety. Take help from people whom you know can help you. Right? Don't be shy about that. And understand things not just as problems, but rather as phenomena. Phenomena is basically as events. The moment you say that, hey, this is the problem, then you sort of define it within a box. Understand it in a little bit of a broader perspective. You say that, okay, these are things that are happening. Now, if we were certain kind of a people, then it looks like a problem, right? That is one of the ways we go about doing it. I realize this might be a tough ask, but yeah. And there are no root causes. Everything has a time component attached to it. Never talk about problems and solutions and phenomena without attaching a time component. You know that, okay, as time will pass, things will change. And that's how. And this is the most important of it all. Be really humble in your approach, by which I mean, know that you do not know it all, that we do not know it all, rather, that we do not actually, we have to keep learning to actually do something of meaning. That's the approach that needs to be taken, rather than saying, hey, this is the problem I'm really good at, like blockchain developing or finance or whatever. I'm going to solve it on my own, or for that matter, or my company is going to solve it on its own. Never going to work. So be really humble and say that, yeah, these are huge problems. We can attempt, solving it, and we're very humble in our approach. We'll keep learning. But we say that this is so huge that you actually need to be very mindful of that. And always watch out for consequences. So they say that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. You might intend, I want to do something really awesome. Right? Again, with the case of the toll, they wanted to do something good, but it turned out that it had huge side effects. Right? And that's why you have to be mindful of consequences of the solutions that you build. And yeah, that's it. Thank you. And now I'm open for questions. I hope that was.
Right. Students, you have unmuting rights now. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them to Mr. Suneet.
Any questions? Yeah, Abhijit, please go ahead. Abhijit, you're in mute. Yeah, Abhijit, are you asking? Abhijit Kumar Sinha?
Yeah, hello. Am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible.
I think
Tushar.
Actually, I was unable to unmute.
Yeah, same.
Okay. Okay, cool. Abhijit, please go.
I was asking that you told that if there is any problem in society, like you gave the example of plastic bottles, there is one another source like bank also fund them. There is a fund to the company so that they can do more business. So if you have to do something for it, so like for a revolt, or we have to do anything to solve those problems, then who will you blame?
See, when you're talking about systems thinking by itself, I haven't gotten to the technicalities of it, right? So there is a huge science that is behind it. It is actually called complexity sciences, right? So we won't get into that. But the word that you use of blame, right? That is not a word that we use very lightly. To blame, all of us are to blame, right? You and me, we consume single-use plastics. We order from Swiggy or from any other restaurant. They give us single-use straws, whatever. There might be changes in nowadays, but we are responsible for consuming single-use plastic. So we are equally to blame as much as people who are producing it. Right? So this word of blame will actually get us nowhere. Rather, what we talk about in systems are dynamics. Now, dynamics is again one of those fancy words which basically means this. Understand how various things are working together, right? So if you just choose to focus on the production cycle, by which I mean companies producing plastic through the money that is given to them by banks. Okay, just let's take that as an example. That is just one part of the dynamics, right? If you want to solve the plastic or address it, let's not call it address it, then you would say that, okay, it is important for companies to be taxed if they are producing plastic. It is important for banks to be regulated, that they cannot invest more than X% in plastic industry, single-use plastic industries. Good, but you've also got to work on the other side, right? On the consumption side. You and me, we need to actually make efforts at an individual level to drop drastically our consumption of plastic, which basically means that restaurants who are giving single-use plastic, they have to stop using it, but they'll only do that. Why? Because the alternative has to be cheaper. Yeah, the alternative has to be cheaper. They are a business, so they have to make money, right? So you talk about these things in tandem. So we don't talk about the blame game. It's never a good idea to say that, hey, you are the one who's responsible for that. What has caused that blame to be shifted to them is a different matter. Public may have, the media may have perceived it as, look at this evil company, right? But that evil company exists because we are the ones who are at the demand side and actually enabling them to produce. We are there to consume. We don't consume, they don't produce. Business doesn't make sense, right? That is why both of these things need to be taken into account. So no. Okay, I hope I've answered the question.
Yes.
Cool. Second was Tushar, I think.
Yeah, hi, Mr. Suneet. I'm Tushar.
Yeah,
so my question was that, I mean, I really enjoyed the presentation. So the implication in society is that small to medium enterprises are the ones that you target, correct? Or does your work also extend to, large corporate organizations, that have multiple offices throughout the world? Or what are the steps they can take to, help society conquer such problems?
Sure. So it's not just small to medium enterprises, by the way. So when you are talking about organizations like the World Health Organization, that's a UN organization that consists of so many countries. It's a global organization, right? Similarly, when you're working with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, then it's a global organization. And apart from that, right? So now it's very, you've got CSR, corporate social responsibility, which is a very smart move, which on the side of the government. So what they said is that if you do good, we are going to give you tax breaks. Very simply put, right? So you do something good for the environment, you do something for education, you do something for societal good, whatever it is, we are going to give you tax breaks. But then companies are also smart. Companies said that we are going to do good, but we're also going to do marketing out of it to get more customers. Right?
Yeah. So
it sort of works in that. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely understand, acknowledge your points, but I was coming more from a point where, the firms that are actively seeking profits for these large corporate firms, not necessarily the World Health Organization and the Bill and Melinda Gates, because these
You're talking
companies
about
and
private organizations.
yeah, something like that, because these organizations have good faith, and they're seen as organizations that would help society, so they don't necessarily have problems at such a large scale. I was talking more of private and very large corporate firms that are pursuing profit maximization currently.
Do you want the realist answer or do you want the ideal answer?
Absolutely the realist answer.
The realist answer. Okay, cool. So see, the reason why these things are called wicked problems is because there's something called incentive alignment. Okay, so what happens is that you might have the best of intentions. If I'm talking from the point of view of a company, let's say that there is this huge company that's churning out tons of plastic waste. Okay, it can be an FMCG or a beverage company, whatever. Right? You know that they are churning out tons of plastic waste. The thing is that the government may say that, hey, you should be responsible for recycling. Okay, but then it turns out that these companies are the people who are actually financing the political campaigns of the people who are elected to office. Fair enough? When you say that you want to create change, right? Whom are you going to go to for help? Are you going to go to the government who's sort of already aligned? Like, I'm not taking names, whatever, but hypothetically, if there's a degree of, let's say, like back scratching for both of them, you can't go to them for help. The degree of change that will then happen has to be simultaneous, right? And I cannot, in fact, nobody can give you an answer as to how this is going to be solved, right? Because wicked problem. But what we can attempt at is degrees of change. This is what we're after. When you have some kind of an incentive alignment for organizations who are profit seeking to actually do this social good, things will change. I'll say what this actually means in simple language. It means that if doing good equals to profits, things will change. Simple. Some things like, for example, green packaging, right, is something that could make good sense. And by the way, again, if you talk about public health as being one of those societal goods, then you'll say that, okay, fizzy, sugary, carbonated drinks, not good. For market demand is changing to healthy stuff. Companies who were earlier selling this fizzy carbonated stuff because like tremendous amounts of profit, now have a new product portfolio which consists of healthy stuff, which makes healthy, and they earn profit out of it. Then in that case, incentive alignment is there and change will happen. This is for profit organizations. Now, the ethicality aspect of it comes second, profit comes first. Only because of incentive alignment, things will change. I hope I've answered the question.
Yep, absolutely. I have just one final question, but I'll wait for
Awesome.
all the other questions to be over because I don't want to take too much time.
Cool. Somebody else. Who else is going? Like, I can't see people's hands here.
Yeah, I have a question.
Anybody else?
Yeah, and so basically, if we think about the problems and stuff, we are assuming that consumers are rational, right? Meaning that, like their needs, like that they need benefit. But then in the case that consumers aren't rational, how would you change the design thinking to ensure that the problem can be solved? Like, is there a way that, design thinking or system thinking is flexible in a way that can even ensure that irrational consumers can benefit?
Consumers are never rational.
Yeah.
Never. So the underlying hypothesis for all macroeconomics is this fictional species of rational beings, but never true, right? So that is why the reason why behavioral economics came into the world is because of this. So you've got books, by the way, called Predictably Irrational, which is by an author called Dan Ariely, and he talks about this kind of stuff, like we are irrational. Systems thinking, right? So again, without getting into some of the core concepts, I can tell you the broad. Whenever you design dynamics, right? Dynamics in the sense that you're trying to understand how a problems, again, how a phenomena is working, forget problem, how a phenomena is working. If you're talking about, again, plastic pollution, you'll say that, okay, rational consumers would opt for cheaper option, right? That is the one of the underlying assumptions that we have, that no matter if it is plastic, no matter it is recyclable package, doesn't matter. As long as it is affordable, I'll go for it. That's what rationality says. Despite that rationality, there are people who are paying more for recyclable stuff because they care about the planet, right? So there is a degree of irrationality, but a different kind of rationality as well, you see? That because now you're thinking beyond yourself, you're talking about the planet and all of that, right? When you talk about systems thinking, the data that we collect in our research is not devoid of assumptions. So we say that, okay, this relationship remaining true, people's preference for cheaper stuff, that is the assumption that we'll make sure that we denote. Okay, we always are testing and challenging our assumptions. Whenever we have any kind of a, again, I can't get into the technicalities, but whenever we say that, okay, this is how these things are functioning together, we say that assuming X and Y are such and such, assuming Z is such and such. So that rationality aspect is always accounted for. Never say that, okay, this statement holds true forever. Never. It's always changing. And that is why temporality or how things change with time is immensely important. And that is where we say that, okay, we are going to challenge these assumptions. And of course, rational, irrational consumers doesn't matter. It has to be challenged all the time.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, who else? There's another one. Tushar, apart from if there's anybody else, otherwise I can take care. Anybody else? Yeah, okay, then cool. Tushar, go ahead.
Yeah, I have more of an opinionated question this time. So over the last 6 or 7 months, there's been the ESG revolution. Firms such as PwC, they're pushing for ESG and stuff. So all of this is in direct relation to helping the society and going for a greener future. Do you think this is more due to the changes in leadership at the top of these large corporate companies, or is it more so that consumers and good faith organizations are pushing for a greener future from these companies? What would be more, I think, determinant on them taking action to go greener?
I'm sorry, I just got, I'll just stop my video, my network's time. Can you just repeat the stuff that you said after good faith organizations? Good faith organizations pushing
So
for?
yeah, so basically good faith organizations, or like, the community pushing for a greener future. What would be more determinant of, the actions that these firms take, the leadership or the community?
So in systems, again, coming back to how dynamics are structured, right? So you're saying the first thing is that, let's say the quality of leaders and their consciousness is getting better. That's one side. Well, let's say that. The second you're saying is that more proactive activism on behalf of the people who actually want to do some good in the world. Let's say that. So you've got these two things. But apart from that also, right, there's so many other factors that account for it. So when you talk about determinism, it's never going to be because of a single factor. Determinism is actually an outcome of a prolonged period of these dynamics interacting together. So let's say that you've got more educated citizens who now are going beyond caste and all of these kind of things to actually vie and select and pick leaders who are capable, who are educated. Example, okay? One side that is happening. So those leaders, the quality of those leaders, of course, has changed. The same people, right? Now, because of a better education that they are receiving and the availability of the internet and like even armchair activism and all of that, that has caused people to become much more conscious, and that may have changed the nature of the demand themselves. So for example, sustainable packaging is something that is a demand, right? Any company who is not catering to this, right, now for them it doesn't make sense, because now it has negative reputational repercussions for them, which is reflected in their business, right? So on one hand, you'll have educated populations choosing better leaders who have better policies in place. On the other hand, the same people, right, they can actually have different dynamics on the demand side. And the interaction of both of these things is actually going to determine what plays out in the near future. Again, subject to certain uncertainties, right? So you cannot say that, okay, this is a laboratory condition thing that's never going to change. But the way these cycles play out, right? If a better leader frames better educational policies lead to more educated population, you'll find that this loop of better and even better leaders getting selected is going to become stronger. Demand too of things that are more socially responsible is going to become stronger. And then the negative loop of only pursuing, like profits, that loop is going to shrink, and which is then going to determine the overall quality of that. If it so turns out that corrupt leaders are elected somewhere in between, which causes, a decline in education, the quality of education policies, etc., then you have lesser educated people, and then you find that, okay, the profit making mechanism again takes control, and then the determinism of that dynamic is going to be exploitation. You see, so this is how, and systems thinking is the perfect way to actually depict all of this. These are called feedback loops, and that's, I'm not getting into technicalities, but these are called feedback loops. You've got amplifying loops, and then you've got shrinking loops. So they are.
Yeah, so that was my question. I think, thank you so much for answering all my questions. You've been a great.
No
Thank you.
problem. Thank you.
Right, guys. If we'll take one last question, because we already have our next guest speaker waiting. So if there are any, please go ahead. Please pass it on towards Suneet, and he'll be very happy to answer them for you. Okay, I would assume in that case, since there are no questions. Thank you once again, Mr. Suneet. It was an excellent presentation, and I have learned a few things. I can tell you that much, and I'm sure the students have learned a lot from your experience as well. There's one thing, which I want to highlight. I myself am a firm believer of the fact you mentioned about change being the only constant. And if that was not true, we would still be walking on four legs. We are all part of the evolution. And also the way you were able to give a detailed picture of wicked business problems, that was just fantastic. It gives me an entirely different perspective altogether. I very quickly also wanted to add a quick note. As you may already know, that COVID is making organizations think differently and do things very differently. And ISBF is no exception to that. And as a token of appreciation, we would like to extend a thank you voucher from an apparel startup, which has been founded by the students of Indian School of Business and Finance. It is called Emacity. It's a startup that desires to contribute towards living sustainability by enabling consumption in the irresponsible era of fast fashion. So thank you so very much for being here with us. Thank you.
And thank you all, of course. And it was an immense pleasure of mine to be here. And of course, as I said, every interaction for me is also an opportunity for me to learn. So it was fun interacting with all of you. And my God, last 12 students asking amazing questions. Like,
trust me, I mean,
amazing stuff.
yeah, I agree with you there, Bain. These are very well informed students and absolutely wonderful
You can
cohort.
see that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Suneet.
Take care, all of you. See ya. Bye-bye. Thanks.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks.
All right, guys, we'll take a quick break of 5 minutes and we'll start the session at 2:10, which is the next session, and that is careers in finance. So please be on time because our next speaker is already here. Thank you.